and welcome to another edition of the Coach and Benway podcast. I'm Coach Red Pill, joined by my co-host, as always, Dr. Benway. Dr. Benway, and today we're going to talk about family, and I think it's a really important topic, to tell you the truth. And Dr. Benway, why don't you intro us on this particular topic?
Never take sides against the family again. That's how he takes it. No, I mean, this was a thought. I've had a desire to talk about this for a while, and it's after, some of you may know, I spend actually a lot of time with my family, and my father in particular. I tend to do my grocery shopping collectively with my parents, and or particularly my father. We're driving around getting all the things we need, so on and so forth. And oftentimes, whether it's on those conversations or in the car or elsewhere, my father is reminiscing about all the various details of his life, his parents' life, what have you. And I always thought to myself, I wish I could record this, not for any nefarious purposes, but because I just want to have the stories available at a later point when he's not in a position to tell them one way or another.
Yeah.
And I thought, I wish I would have had the same thing for my grandparents. Right?
Yeah.
And I remember, getting all the various details, they had. My father's stories. I always remember he was saying when he was a kid, roughly my age, if not, a little younger than my age. Like when he was in Chicago during the Chicago protest, the Democratic Convention protests.
Yeah.
He said he was walking home one night, and he saw from the night emerging from the Lincoln Park, the protesters running in the opposite direction because they were trying to get away from the head bashing police.
Right.
And he also remembers the race riots after Martin Luther King was assassinated, and he lived in a borderland between an Italian and a black community. And he remembers distinctly when he go up to this road that was blocked by the police because there were riots going in there. And my father says, I live down there. He says, don't go down there. And he says, I have to. I live there. Cop says something to the effect of good luck kind of thing. Father made it home, fine. But, those little details and those little bits of story are the things that I always will remember them. And I want to have them like in a kind of treasury trove because that, it's the continuity and it's like the lived experience of everything. I think I even told you after we had recorded the Vietnam episode, I actually talked to my father about all of his friends who did go to Vietnam. I think I told you a few of those, and that it certainly doesn't necessarily mean that I didn't get anything out of the Ken Burns documentary on Vietnam. Far from it. It just added even more richness and texture to it because this is a lived experience now.
I think that as a society, we don't value enough what the older generation has to say. And I know from my own experience that when I was younger, I really could not care less what my grandparents were saying about stories of this or that, the other. It's only as I got older that I started caring about them a lot more and sort of like trying to collect them and know them. And I think that as a society, we don't value that. And what happens is that, there's also the natural impulse of young people that they think, it's the old people, they're saying the same old shit as usual. A lot of the stuff that they say is, the same old shit as usual. But among that shit, among that, just rocks, there are a few diamonds here and there. And sometimes those diamonds are really, really valuable. The trick is to be able to identify them and to record them somehow. Especially nowadays with all the technology, it's so easy to do so. You can get a $100 audio recorder that can record, hours and hours of material easily, unobtrusively, without any kind of technical knowledge, something that was unimaginable a few years ago. We have all this technology, but we're not using it wisely, it seems to me.
Well, it also seems, I don't want to say this is universally true, but it's certainly common enough. It just feels like there's and I think there's two elements to it. It's like, why don't we have these conversations with our parents or grandparents, or why do we feel like it's too late by the time we get to a position where we wanted them? And I think it's twofold, especially now. I think for me, it was more I waited too long, and the interest didn't come up till later, and it was my grandparents were much older than me. My parents are older than me. My father was 40 when I was born, and so my grandparents all died around the time I was in high school and exiting or entering college, was when the last grandparent died.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually missed the ideal opportunity to get all of the stories. I got some of them,
Yeah.
but it's usually mediated through my parents. And so there was that. I think there's that element to it. There's a lack of interest, but I think also recently, for some folks, I think there's a lack of content. Right. I think you perpetuate a society of disinterested people, or people who just constantly live in the now and the moment. And it's like, it reminds me of that line from Patton when they said, you don't want to reach that point where you're talking to your grandkids and they ask you, what did you do in the Great World War II? And you said, well, son, I shoveled shit in Louisiana. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's, I think there's a lot of that going on. There's a lot of, well, what do I think a lot of, what are a lot of folks are going to say about like the shit they didn't do in the 80s, or, oh, I voted for Reagan, kind of thing. That's not really the compelling story.
Well, what happens is that our bar for what is compelling story has been altered. Like just about everything in our society, because of the communications technology, we can hear these amazing stories. And so the more quotidian stories, the quieter stories, they're blasted out. It's like you have this tiny radio, and you want to hear it, but then the guy comes along with the huge boom box that just blows it away, and it overwhelms the tiny little radio. But see, the tiny little radio is important because it's yours. The experiences of your own family, quotidian and pedestrian though they may be, and perfectly ordinary, and perhaps in a way, quote unquote, boring. Well, they're valuable precisely because they're your stories. They're not somebody else's stories, and they're not manufactured stories. And that's the thing that we tend to forget. We tend to compare manufactured stories, made-up stories, with the ordinary stories that our own families and the people we love have actually experienced. And we sort of like, we fail to distinguish the value of one and and not the inherent valuelessness of the other, but rather it's not personal. See?
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing. That's the difference. You hear some amazing story about somebody who, I don't know, was in Vietnam and all kinds of things happened to him, right? But that's the story of a stranger. It's an interesting story, but it's not the story of somebody that either you know directly, like your parents, or that you knew indirectly, like your great-grandparents. And that affected them. That was real to them, For example, I have a specific story that I always think about. See, let me see, it was my great-great-grandmother was this, she was a daughter of a preacher. And she basically convinced she met this Chilean sea captain who had visited Denmark. And he was also of Danish descent. And she fell in love with him. And she convinced her older sister for the two of them to go after him, basically. And they chased him all the way to Chile, to Valparaiso. And she married him, right? It was pretty wild, right? I mean, she was some kind of woman, right? My maternal grandmother's grandmother, okay? Anyway, the point is this woman, she had younger brothers. And one of those younger brothers emigrated to the United States. And there was a story that she heard from letters that he was crossing the United States and got to Washington State. And he was, walking along some road. And some guy's car, and this was like, very early or even buggy or something like that. I actually don't know if it was a car or a buggy. It doesn't matter. He repaired it. It was broken, and he repaired it. And the man was so impressed that he invited him to go with him to the next town where he had a store, and he'd give him a job. And he got a job, and eventually married the daughter of the store owner, and he just had this business, out in Washington. And it's a trivial story, but it's in the scheme of things, it's a trivial story. But that's an actual story that actually happened, right? And to somebody that, yes, of course, I never met these people, but they are my antecedents, they are my forefathers, and it happened to them. And this man who helped this, store owner or whatever, was my great uncle. And he's somebody that there was a connection to. And yeah, sure, the story is, if you compare it to Gone with the Wind, it's trivial, but it's a real story that actually happened, and that's why it makes it
Yeah.
invaluable. I'm sorry.
So you exist in the continuity of everybody who came before you. This is the fundamental kind of, I would say, argument, right, of a lot of right wing minded folks, that the individualness is insufficient. You're a lot more than that. And it's
Yes.
funny how you mentioned that, like the quotidian, like, because for my family story is odd in that it has both extremes. There are
Yeah.
family stories involving family members who were in the Russian Civil War, the Russian Revolution, surviving the Ukrainian famine, the fighting on the Eastern Front in World War II, family members and close family friends in Vietnam, and all of the rest of those things. So you have these big movements,
Yeah.
right, of activities, and being kind of interesting. The grandparents, great grandparents, and great great grandparents being interesting players in that. But also mixed with that would be like the quotidian stories I always remember. Like, it's the thing of with my immediate family is, and this is interesting because my family, unlike perhaps most people, is my father's family and my mother's family were actually close with each other. In fact, my mother's mother and my father's mother not only were best friends, but they knew each other in, for lack of a better term, the displaced persons camps
Mm-hmm.
in the aftermath of World War II. That's where they first met,
Mm-hmm.
and the families and the close family friends existed as almost like a clan. Like they would, there's like 6 or 7 families that, even if they were dispersed around the city of Chicago, were always together for all like events, like holiday events, Christmas, New Year's, all sorts of things. And there's always the random stories of their drunken reverie. And I mean that, and I don't mean that in a kind of dismissive way. Some of them that were a little nasty drunk, but most were just ridiculous. And all of like the little stories of their shenanigans, almost like the golden age of Marx Brothers comedy kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like how even this may not be funny to anyone but myself, but I remember the story they talked about how at my grandmother's house, one of the patriarchs of one of the other families was getting excited, having a good time, slips and falls and breaks a little glass table. And my grandmother was like, "Oh, you must pay for that table." And he just, gets up, has a drink, and says, "You must pay for my ass, woman," and all that kind of stuff. And the other neighbor who, just, got, so drunk at the neighbor's house that he came over to my family's house, mistaking it for his own house, went into my parents' bedroom, had a nap, and told him, "Get the fuck out of his house. What are you doing in there?" And, and really adamant that he had made the right decision and everything. And all those little details about like the little reverie
Mm-hmm.
of the community and how it was like, and the vibrancy of it was interesting. The closest movie to it, for those who are interested, the movie, I don't know if you ever saw the movie Avalon, the Barry Levinson film.
Yeah, I saw it
It's
years ago. Yeah,
yeah, that's him remembering his grandparents and
mm-hmm.
parents' story, and that's more or less the dynamic. They're Jewish, but Slavic Jewish or
Yeah.
Polish Jews, and so it's not terribly different from my family, but it has that kind of element of it. And it's funny, you even get, when I watch The Godfather, even though that's Italian, I think Sicilian Italian, and
Mm-hmm.
funny enough, one of my aunts married a Sicilian, so I actually am familiar with that. Leaving that aside, that tone of that sort of European immigrant community, even then, that's very evocative of our weddings and our cultural attitudes towards things, our notions of family and whatnot. So it's those little stories that are that almost stick more so than even some of the bigger stories I could tell you about fighting in the Russian Civil War.
Yeah, but the thing that's interesting is that today, because of this cult of individuality, we are all taught to sort of like actively not want to have any kind of contact with older generation. It's all outward looking and individualistic, and we go off to college and we see our family, for Thanksgiving and or Christmas and maybe the 4th of July, I guess. I don't know what's another time that people travel. Certainly Thanksgiving, certainly Christmas, but lots of times they don't go to both. They go to one or the other because of the expense and the hassle and this, that, the other. And people live far away from one another, and they don't really want to have much to do with their family of origin, because there is the inevitable problem that a lot of times you will not find your parents that interesting and compelling. I think it's a natural state of affairs.
Right.
But the fact that you have to put up with them, if you're forced by circumstances to live with them, forces you to, number one, adapt to their outlook and see the world more in the way that they do, which inherently makes your view tends towards more conservative view. If you're young, right? Because you are compelled to look at the world from their point of view, and you start to see things from their point of view. I remember there was this one period of time when I was about 15 years old, when we were moving from the United States to Chile, and so I was sent ahead for the summer, for the Chilean summer, so I could prepare, so I could take these exams, so as to skip a grade. Okay, so I just, it was just like a couple of months. It couldn't have been more than that. And I went to my grandparents, and I stayed with my grandparents, and my grandparents were very formal people. And every lunchtime, it was like a full-on lunch, right? We'd sit down at the table, at the dining room table. My grandfather, my grandmother, and myself. My grandfather had come back from work. He worked in insurance, and he'd come back. I think it was like at 1:00. He'd come through the door, and we'd sit down and have lunch. And the maid would come with these big platters, on a tray and service, for like formal service, right? Every lunchtime. And, she'd talk about stuff, because my grandmother was a big talker. I mean, a huge talker. And she'd talk about things, and she was extremely politically conservative. And I was a 15-year-old boy. I didn't know shit from Shinola, right? And she would talk about things during the Allende government. Okay, which this is like in 1983, so it was only 10 years before, for a grown woman, just a blink of an eye. And she would talk about the details, the nitty-gritty details of living during the Allende government, okay? And so every day, for like basically roughly an hour, I'd be politically indoctrinated by my grandmother, right? But the thing is, she would tell me the specifics, the nitty-gritty of living under the Allende government and how horrible it was. And so my outlook, inevitably, I started to see the Allende government from her perspective. Okay? And here's what's interesting. My dad was a lot more left-leaning. He was like left of center, and he wasn't like a commie. I mean, he was a fucking banker, right? So how commie do you think he actually was, right? But the point is, my parents, we had not lived the Allende government because we'd been out of the country, because my dad had been pursuing his career, and also we'd been told, don't come back because the situation is horrible, right? And so my parents' view of the Allende government was very skewed because it wasn't realistic, because they hadn't been there rather, in Chile. Whereas my grandmother's was it was her lived experience, and she told me the details of it. And those details changed my vision of the Allende government forever. I could never look at it as something good, because here was my grandmother telling me how she had gone to the CAP, which is the Committee for Supply and Pricing, which was like the local communist cabal to ration food. And she told me how she'd gone, and she had been told by the head of the committee that she was going to be the last in line because she was clearly an oligarch. Okay? And so my grandmother had to just shop everything on the black market because the ration boards controlled by the government refused to give her any food, any basic supplies. I'm talking rice, cooking oil, that kind of stuff, because she was clearly an oligarch. Okay? And that she was telling me she experienced that. And it wasn't something that somebody told her or anything. No. She was there. She was a witness. And that experience, of course, when she was droning on, and not droning on, because she was a very passionate woman and a very good storyteller. But, I was a boy. I was 15, and here's my grandmother, a grown woman of 60 or whatever. And so she's, thundering about this stuff. And I had no equipment to be able to argue with her, of course, even if I'd wanted to, because, I didn't want to upset my grandmother. But the thing is, see, later, when I read more history, my view of the Indian government, I'd read this history and I'm like, what the fuck are they talking about? Because I was thinking of my grandmother. Even when I didn't really pay attention to my grandmother's stories, enough of it was internalized. And I think that is so lacking today,
Yes. Well, I had a similar dynamic with my father's mother. My father's mother being the Russian
Mm-hmm.
part of the family. Interesting for me, you had mentioned something. When we start out, our parents are not something we're very compelled by, probably because you live with them the whole time, and you're in that situation where they're mundane because you just are with them the whole time, and eventually you need to look for something that's, you define the exotic or the interesting as that which is not mundane, right? So it's that which you don't encounter every time you have. And it was later in my life, growing up, that in looking for that, in part because you would reach the point where you would be taught about, be it World War II or history, whatnot. Even if you weren't taught about it, if you were like me and you had an interest in it, you started reading up on it. So it was funny how, with my grandmother's situation, how those stories came up. It was, in a weird way, it came up through her cooking, because my grandmother was a very good cook, cooked everything. My father gets his cooking interest from her, and I naturally get it down that line. But what kind of like where we came up with, what was the genesis of it as well? She is a child of the Russian, for lack of a better term, the aristocracy, and she and her brother were orphaned as a result of the Civil War. Her father was killed, not even in battle; he was imprisoned. And the way that the family tells the story, it was like a staged murder in the prison. There was one of those stories where they were distributing food amongst the various prisoners. There was a fight over this food or the other because people were starving, and somebody killed off, my great grandfather, and that was kind of that. So she's alone with her brother, and they grew up, or they were born in Kursk, which is on the border of Ukraine and Russia. And they would spend a lot of their time in the Ukrainian area, and that was during the famine period, the forced famine period. And she had to get her brother out of the Ukraine and to the other end of Russia where other family members were. I think some were, approaching, if not in the Siberian region. That's how far she had to go. And in order to survive the extreme famine situation, she basically learned from what I think probably was a midwife, but in certain circles you would have called her either a medicine woman or a witch. She taught her, like, look, if you eat these roots or these grasses, these will satiate certain pains, or you'll make it through. Or if you're feeling ill, this is gonna sound disgusting. If you drink your own urine, you have a better shot at kind of surviving under certain conditions.
Yeah.
And she taught her all of that, and her ability to kind of like just know the natural, why certain products or vegetables or plant life does what it does. Eventually evolves itself into, she's just very facile with using ingredients, with cooking and whatnot. So that's how we got the story. And you combine that in my mind with when I would read about the starvation, and you knew you were in a situation where it was so bad, parents were eating their children.
Yeah.
And I thinking to myself, these are two orphans. She's barely a teenager at this point. She has to keep her brother alive and herself alive at a time when people are eating children.
Yeah.
It's basically a fairy tale kind of situation. But what you realize is just the extremis of the situation, right? When it operates on the level of fairy tale, that there's some sort of, it's almost like a cosmic force that's kind of shaping this history. And, I can give you many stories of that going backwards with what little she remembers about her father, and going forwards from, when she was basically a refugee in Germany after, the war complicates things and whatnot. And that, little bit of, like I said, lived energy makes the war situation very interesting. And the other thing that I encountered, maybe it's different from your family situation, but what I had heard from my parents, they told me when it came to that period, the war and before the war, they would, whenever these clans of families were together, it's like it was like the main thing they talked about amongst themselves because they all lived it. But when if like me, the grandkids started asking questions, they had a hard time talking about it. They could talk about it with themselves. They could not talk about it from the outside. And when they did, it was very uncomfortable for them, which is why, and the fact that their discomfort with it, the fact that they never really told anybody else about it, and then they kind of opened up, it was proof positive to me, and people can yell at me and say what they want and whatnot, that they're not lying to me when they say what the Germans did or what they were, the atrocities that were going on. There's no reason to believe they're lying.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know,
No, no.
this shit happened.
Yeah, I have no doubt whatsoever that the Germans, the Nazis, did what they are accused of. That the Soviets did what they are accused of. I think that this kind of like on both sides, on the extreme left and the
Both
extreme
sides,
right,
yes.
that sort of like try to minimize the atrocities of the Nazis and the Soviets. Now, go tell that, go sell that bullshit somewhere else because we're all natives around here. We know the score. So yeah, I don't buy that. I think it's different because in the case of like my grandparents talking to me about the Allende government, it never got to a point of trauma. Okay, it got to a crisis point, but not trauma. Same with like the earthquakes, because in Chile we have periodically, almost exactly every 25 years, we have massive earthquakes. We had one in 2010, which I experienced in 1985, 25 years before, in 1960, 25 years before, in 1938, 22 years before. These are catastrophic earthquakes. I mean, end of the world earthquakes. The one in 1960, for instance, was the most powerful earthquake ever recorded. It was just, catastrophic, okay? But the thing is, see, that kind of thing, it's a catastrophe, but it's oddly not, it's not traumatic in the way that you're describing, okay?
Right.
First of all, it's not traumatic because people are used to them. People know that a big one is going to come. And so when it does come, it doesn't traumatize people. It's like,
Right.
holy shit, that was a big one, like the 2010, nobody's like walking around with PTSD or some shit like that. Okay, that's why I tend to think that all this PTSD is sort of like, I think that in certain circumstances, yeah, I buy it when it's like extreme stress of like the potential actual death every second. But it's just a little bit of, trauma or a little bit of a shock. Come on, I mean, grow up.
Yeah,
Right?
you had 15 minutes of like, whoa, this like for example, I'm not traumatized by this plane, a flight I took on a plane that really it was like it wasn't just bad turbulence. It was like you had to make an emergency landing type thing. I don't feel traumatized by
No.
that because it was about at most like 15 minutes or less, probably closer to like 2 or 3 minutes
Yeah.
of like oh Jesus Christ, that happened. And
Yeah.
I certainly have a story about it, but it's not like I have trouble flying at
Yeah,
this point.
exactly. I mean, like, I can understand Vietnam veterans who were in combat for a year, really fucking out of their minds with fear that they were going to get booby trapped, that they were going to get ambushed, that they were going to get blown up. I mean, that. Yeah, I buy that. That gives you like trauma, but just a little bit of come on. I mean, grow up. Anyway,
Mhm.
like the point I'm trying to make is that, see, I think that there's a difference between remarkable events and trauma, and what you're describing of your grandparents is traumatic. It's and yeah, that being unable to discuss it with people who didn't live it, but being able to only discuss it with people who were there and who knew. Yeah, that's the mark of a trauma on the one hand, and that, yeah, exactly as your point, it proves it actually happened. But more to the point, see, you have that living memory of them having that reaction, okay,
Yes.
and you saw it, and so because of it, because you saw it, you see, you feel, you perceive the reality of it. It's not something that you read about in a book. You,
You're going exactly where I wanted to go, which was like as a like the closest thing you can sort of get to this is I think you're well aware of like the Studs Terkel books on the Depression and the
yeah,
war. I think the Depression is like working. I think that's literally the title of the book. I think,
yeah,
and the war is I think just called the war. And he's got a number of those books, and there's certainly live interviews, right? Just transcribed. And I think even the audio of a number of them exist, and that was his show. But it's not the same thing, even if you heard the audio, because there's the visual reading of the physicality of the discussion
Mm-hmm.
that adding a significant layer to the story. Like when I see my father uncomfortable talking about what happened to his friends in Vietnam, and I even like his best friend who's since passed away, but even I remember when he was alive, even talking about it, the experience. When I see it on my grandparents, there's a just like in when we talked about a long time ago the Hemingway stories, how the iceberg theory, there's a lot underneath it. The physicality of telling the story tells its own story as well, very dramatically. You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah. Because the thing is, see, because we've grown so far apart, we're not seeing older people. Okay.
Yeah.
And to go back to an earlier point I made, older people are more conservative. And I've noticed that a lot of young people who are mindlessly liberal, they more often than not do not have any kind of connection to the past. They don't know their grandparents or don't talk to them, so they don't know how difficult life can be. Because it's difficulty
Right.
in life that gives you a more conservative outlook on life and makes you recognize that a lot of times you just got lucky. You're very, very fortunate. And so you should uh, take very good care of your good luck. And because younger people don't have that interaction with older people, they they don't catch on to that natural conservatism. That's why I brought up the long story of eating lunch at my grandmother's table,
Right.
because even when I was not paying attention, her whole outlook was horrible things can happen. You got to be very careful. Don't let these fucking commies come near power because they'll make a hash of it. Look what happened this time. And it just, I
Yeah.
internalized that. And with that lived experience, because of the lived details, because it's those little details that make things all the more different. Because see, my grandmother she was the one who did the grocery shopping. Okay, she would go out. She'd get all dressed up in like a nice outfit and all made up and stuff. And with jewelry and shit like that. And she looked like a very nice upscale lady. And she would go out and go shopping. It was her thing, her routine. And my grandfather would be off, busting heavies at the office, and she'd go and do the grocery shopping. And she had like a little like a grocery bag. It was really funny because it was like this mesh bag that she would take with her, and she would buy all the groceries. Okay, and I sometimes would go with her during the summer that I'm telling you that I was like preparing for these exams. And as I would go with her, and we'd talk and stuff like that, and she'd get to the market, and she'd pick the groceries and all the thing. And so I saw this routine of hers. I saw it directly. I was right there. And so when she would tell me that she did the same routine and went to the committee that was controlled by the socialists, and they wouldn't give her food because just by looking at her, they identified her as the oligarchic class. See, it gave an immediacy to the experience. And automatically, it added to my conservatism. Okay? Not because it was the goddamn socialists who were doing this, but because it added to my notion that we have it good. Okay, now we have it good. Back then it was bad, but now it's good. So we better make sure we take care of the now because it might turn bad like it was before. You see that conservative,
Yes.
yeah, you get a little bit black pilled. Okay, and because
Yeah.
of it, you get more conservative. But I realize that people who have not had that experience, who've been completely dissociated from the trials and tribulations of their older generation. Because your experience and my experience are radically different of our grandparents, okay? Just completely different and all the rest of it. But the end result is the same. We realize that life is difficult and things can go tits up very easily. And that has
Hmm.
given us a conservative outlook. But young people who are disassociated from their older generation and have no clue how their grandparents or great grandparents suffered and had a rotten time, then they have this kumbaya notion of society and of reality that's just
It's because
bizarre.
they've been abstracted away
Yeah,
from the community.
yeah,
And it's funny because when you're talking about it's, how in our society there doesn't seem to be an interest in the elderly. And I think in some sense, it's a product of a certain type of person in a certain generation that, typically, but not always, that does this. So, I know a number of people, and I'm sure you know a number of people who said, I simply cannot stand my parents. I just couldn't get along with them. They were awful people, and I disassociate them, myself with my family and all of this other thing.
mm,
Well, you don't just disassociate it with yourself; you then disassociate it with your children by definition.
yeah,
They never know their grandparents. They never know their aunts and uncles. They never know all of these other things. And as a result, you compound that over a period of time, and you do not only do you get the individualistic attitude, but you get a notion of humanity which is not based on a direct communication with humanity. Oftentimes it's an abstracted notion of like, oh, the people are, objectively this or objectively that and whatnot, whereas you and I, by virtue of having these firsthand encounters and experiences, you're quickly not dismissive, but you're quickly bemused by ideas of the perfectibility of man,
yeah,
because you see the exact outcome of stories of man's infinitely un, uh, perfectible nature.
yeah,
Actually, they're debased nature in many ways.
yeah.
So you, in some sense, prepare yourself. But there's also, like I said, and it's funny how I looked at in my own extended family. I know the members of the family that I get along with and I didn't. And it was funny how there was a shift that occurred relatively recently. When I was younger, I have a pair of cousins, twin brothers, who are only a year older than me. When we were young kids, we got along very well. But as we all grew older and we all became professionals, they both became accountants, and they both got married to a certain type of woman. It's funny, they more or less married the same woman in two different bodies. They're twin cousins, so it's not a surprise.
Well, what kind
And
of woman, actually?
uh, not a terrible woman by any stretch of the term, but same kind of physicality,
Hmm.
long dark hair. Um,
No, but I mean,
you
like
know,
temperamentally, I'm curious.
Basically, they married their mother.
Okay.
My aunt is their mother, my mother's sister, and they more or less married a more attractive version, younger version of it. But as they continued in their professional careers, I could see their interests devolving into that non-culture American culture. And it's I say it that way because my uncle always said that, and some of our audience may take offense to this, but I'm going to phrase it in a way that you actually shouldn't. He referred to it as like, oh, they become American, which is like the Italian accent of, oh, it's just American white bread, not interested in much of anything than making money. The joke of that is I actually don't consider that necessarily American culture. I think that's just non-culture of capitalism, and America just happens to be the best example of that now. It's not particularly American any more than it's particularly anything else. It's just bleh. And when I started getting more and more into the family history, the details, I started becoming closer to my other cousins who are a little bit younger than me, but also have that interest.
Hmm.
It completely did like a 180. And I'm much closer to them now than my other cousins who, frankly, like I said, they're more interested in, having a good productive quarter and, getting their bonuses and everything. That's really all they talk about, the occasional sports ball and what routes they took to get to this location from where they started at. It's like they got lost into the non culture of mass society, and it's not even that I don't recognize them. It's that there's just nothing to them anymore. And I think it's also a byproduct of what we said. Why do people not talk to the older generation? Why do they not remember this? It's like, well, that's what happens. You become part of that culture. And I know that they're not even interested in having these discussions. They find it boring whenever we talk about the old family stories. Whereas I'm in the position of, I get most excited at the family parties when they start talking about my parents' generation. They talk about when they were young and all the stories they remembered about their parents and what their parents told them about their grandparents.
Yeah, because that continuity, that sense that your a continuation of a line. It doesn't matter how humble that line may be, or how convoluted that line may be, but that you're tethered to something. This notion of being completely untethered, which is what you're telling me basically about your cousins. They want
Yeah.
to be untethered. They want to be like balloons floating in the sky with no connection to their past, no connection to where they came from, even a notion of where they came from. And it's all the now, the moment, without, any connection, any grounding. Okay? And I think about this for me, one of the great metaphors in my imagination that I've yet to be able to fully express in some kind of written form is the notion of untethered balloons, bright balloons in a clear blue sky. Because I think of that untethering that's so American, because it's not just the untethering from any kind of, from your predecessors, from your ancestors, but it's also moral untethering. It's also epistemic untethering. It's being just, in epistemology, I studied epistemology. So for those of you, I'm going to bore you a little bit with a little sidetrack on basic philosophy. Epistemology is the theory of knowledge. I mean, how do you know something? Okay, like for instance, you look at something, you look at a glass on a table, and you say, well, there's a glass on a table. And the question becomes, how do you know that? Well, because I have eyes that see, and my eyes perceive it, and my eyes, have always been, correct about this. And then you start like digging further, and eventually the current model is that there's something called justified true belief. You have a belief of something. That belief is true, and you are justified in holding that belief. That's the current standard model. It came from a guy called Gettier in the early 60s. But that's the basic epistemic model that philosophy is working with today. But there's the notion of foundationalism, the idea that you know something because you have a foundation, a fixed foundation. And before it was God, right? And now we no longer have God. And so now there is basically skepticism. Because of skepticism, you can undercut any one of those three legs of the tripod: justification, truth content, or belief. And you can ultimately say, well, there's no foundation for you to be justified in thinking of something, or that it's true, or that you even have the belief. And so there have been all sorts of efforts to fix this issue, that we no longer have a foundation insofar as epistemology is concerned. The same with morality. We don't have a foundation on which to base a moral framework, let alone moral judgment. And so we're just sort of like untethered, just drifting, okay? And I think that this is a catastrophe. And I think that this untethering, I'm talking about, philosophy, philosophical questions, but it ultimately goes to something as quotidian as being untethered from your forefathers, from the family that you came from. This severing of those ties, that breaking of the chain of continuity, of like you being the child of somebody, the grandchild of somebody, the great-grandchild of somebody, and you in turn becoming the father of somebody, the grandfather of somebody, the great-grandfather of somebody. It's broken. It's just the individual. I'm coming to the conclusion that individualism is the cancer, and that we have to turn our backs on it. And we have to self-consciously go back to something more organic and more connected. Because I think that so many of our problems as a society and as a people, as a civilization, come from individuality. I think that individuality served us well for a time, but ultimately has become cancerous. Just like everything taken to extreme becomes cancerous.
I think, you could argue that there's many ways to argue against the America as the melting pot, right?
Yeah.
Well, one of the things about the melting pot is when all the bits of metal, when you go into that furnace, you become just a generic massive whatever is in the pot, right?
Yeah.
And that's the dark side of that idea, which is you become what my cousins became, which is nothing. You don't really have, you're nothing but the latest body I can put on this project and do this task because I told you jump like a dog, right? Oh, but I chose it, and that's my individual decisions. Yeah, your individual decisions are a collection of what you bought and what you do on a job, or what you're told to do. very individualistic. But it was funny on your image of the balloon, the untethered balloon. The closest thing I could come from it in recent memory, at least in fiction, is remember Forrest Gump's doing his, the feather in the wind business, and now that's a little bit different in the sense that I don't think the metaphor is necessarily focused on, the disconnection with.
I think it's more serendipity. Yeah, I think that was.
Yeah, it's more, but it's kind of similar in the sense that life is just like you could say it's like a box of chocolates. You don't know what you're going to get, or hey, we're kind of like a feather in the breeze. I can't control it. I don't know where I came from, where I'm going. Fuck it. Let's just do it.
Yeah.
And it's funny because that story is generally thought of as conservative, and I think in some regards Forrest sort of naively is. But nevertheless, you could also say that Jenny, the other character, the hippiest type, the one who thinks she's going to control the world, is also a feather in the wind, and look what happens to her. She's literally consumed.
Actually, I think that we should do a video on Forrest Gump because I have a lot of thoughts on it. And
we should.
Yeah. So, okay, let's set that thought aside. But going back to the untethered balloon metaphor, that to me seems to be the central metaphor of our lives in our current society. And it's we're bright and shiny, and it's really pretty. It's pretty imagery. And all the balloons are pretty, and each of them very individually and very different colored are very pretty, but they're just isolated from one another. They bump up against one another, but they don't really connect. They just float randomly, rubbing up and bumping up against one another and then bumping up against different ones. And of course you see this in all kinds of ways, from the obvious, vulgar sexual metaphor to in the more important ways, insofar as, we have like disposable friends. We're friends with people for a while, and then, we just toss them overboard. In my own case, I have to admit that something that troubles me deeply is that over the decades, I've had what I thought were deep friendships that either the other person, or I myself, sort of like threw overboard and just moved on and forgot about. And I feel deeply troubled by that, because it seems to me now that all that time spent with these people who were my friends at some point or another, it was just transient, because we've been talking about families, but it seems to me that with friendships, we're doing the exact same thing. We treat friendships as just momentary and not lifelong. And I think that that's so tragic. You know what I mean?
No, it's right. I mean, I may have said this earlier. There are very few friends I have remaining that are really long and persistent, but I'm glad for them. I mean, like my best friend I've known since high school, actually, and still maintain that relationship, even though we're separated, in different states. That we're text messaging each other every day. That feels to me also a byproduct of how you're expected to operate. I know in my circles, you just by virtue of the work, you have long hours with people as your coworkers. There's actually a pretty intense relationship that can come about that, not in a kind of physical way, though that sometimes happens, but certainly you spend so many hours with someone, and if you're working over the course of a year somewhere, you spend more time with them in some instances than other people in your life, and you will develop a friendship with them. But as soon as you transition out, I can't tell you how many times I've complete separation, never say, hey, how's it going, what's up. It's like as if they never existed. And I've seen people adopt the attitude at work, because once they know someone's leaving, it's like, can't be bothered to talk to you. Even if they tried, even if they wanted to, And so I just feel like that the uprootedness also just goes to your, the work life also facilitates it more. It's like, I'm just going to uproot from this city, and I'll go to this city for this other job. And you're just doing it for the money at the end of the day. I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but the money leads you to where you're going to go, which also means that you abandon the friends you have here. You'll make new friends. And friends get reduced to acquaintances, and eventually they get reduced to the single-serving friends of Fight Club.
Yeah. It seems. How could I put this? You don't want to fall for the sunk cost fallacy of like having input a lot of effort and time into a relationship, and then realize that it's not a good relationship for you. Because there are some friends that are toxic. There are some friends that you don't really want around because they bring out the worst in you, right? I mean, there's a reason that your parents and grandparents said, "Oh, don't hang out with that boy. He's bad company." Yeah, because you wind up acting like your friends act, and so you want your kid or your grandkid to hang out with the nice kids, and perhaps they're a little bit more boring. But as a grown man, I recognize that my friends influenced me far more than anybody else because I wanted to be like my friends. I wanted to be considered cool in their eyes, and so it's important who you put your who your friends are. And it's understandable that sometimes a friend that you've devoted a lot of time and effort to, in terms of you've done a lot of things together and what have you, and then you realize he's just a bad influence on you, and so you separate it. I mean, yeah, I understand that. I'm not arguing that we should fall for the sunk cost fallacy of like continuing with a relationship even after you realize that it's a bad relationship that will hurt you. Okay.
I think it's more like we have a stillborn situation, which is to say you're not even encouraged to go down the path to enable a lifelong friendship. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Certainly. Yeah. I mean, I get you. Like you're going to be in those situations where it's like, certain friendships just have to have a natural end. It's just the way that they were kind of created and they move on. But, when you're in that position where you're constantly encouraged, like, oh, the transientness of this, or friends are about, building your network and everything, you naturally are going to encounter and create certain types of friendships over the others. I mean, if you were told and encouraged that, everybody should have, I'm just going to oversimplify, everybody should have a best friend and it should be a lifelong friendship. And out of it, you get, nothing material, but you have like an enriched soul and experience. Yeah. More people probably would be encouraged to have like the friendship that I have. Right. But I don't think that's necessarily encouraged, especially, and I see it, whether they know it or not, like at a young age when you organize play dates, right? And you go to certain types of schools or others, and you have this notion of like your life is has a teleological project to it. Like you have to start from point A, and by point Z, you better have achieved X, Y, and Z and done all of these important intermediate steps. Everything's a transaction at that point. All friendships become transactional, and in my mind, they're never really friendships.
I think that going back. I mean, I completely agree with what you're saying, but I'm thinking back of the Jewish project insofar as their development, because they keep those bonds, those familial bonds, that chain, in a way that Gentiles do not, at least in our current society. I mean, they're more old world. Okay. I wonder if it's because of the very nature of their religion, or if it's a cultural thing that their religion is sort of like attached to it, or I'm wondering how it happens, because they don't forego the family, that family connection, the way Gentiles do. And go ahead.
I have a theory. My theory on that is it relates to their transient nature of their people for a long time.
Yeah.
When you're in a position where, your situation in any given part of the world is precarious at best, and you're, dispersed, and the only thing you have to kind of protect yourself is the people similarly situated to you, you band together and you maintain those connections. Part of the reason I brought up my own family history is why I say it reminds me a little bit of Polacks, not necessarily Polacks in Poland, though that, the way that if you look at the Polish state, maybe even in the state, they operate that. But there was a time when Poland didn't exist, and it also was a diaspora population. Even in my family, Poland existed under communist rule, but the seven, like I said, the 6 or 7 families here, they operated in some sense like Jews would, in that clannishness, those shared stories, keeping together. Because frankly, those little ethnic groups were really all that was there to, number one, have a memory of what their cohesive whole was, and to have that, shared experience and point of view that will get you through the day, and not just the day, the years, the decades, go on down the road. I think that has something to do with it. And like I said, the reason I brought up my own family is because under similar conditions, you can see it happen in other populations.
You know, the more I think about it, the more it seems to me that the traditional white Anglo-Saxon Protestant population is just vanishing because of that, because of this being untethered balloons floating away from one another, and other peoples being more cohesive, just clinging on to one another in a more cohesive and continuous whole. Because it seems to me that the white population, if you want to put it like that, the dominant ethnic group, for a variety of reasons, has become untethered from one another to such an extent that they can't continue together. You know, I mean that's what it seems like to me.
And I also think the prosperity disadvantaged them. By that I mean, when you weren't, up until recently, and even then not so much really, because you were not disadvantaged or under duress. You know, it's not like, oh, England was conquered by the Norwegians, the Spanish, and the Icelanders, and thus the sense of Englishness was gone. That never happened. And you always had this little island. America, the waspy Americans always had New England and the various other states up until, obviously recently things could very well change and seem to be changing. Because they were never under duress, the notion that there was something there that you had to protect and kind of take care of and share, people probably took that so much for granted for so long that when you got to something like the 60s, it's just very easy to just feel like, oh, it's just, I have no bonds to it. I mean, think about James Joyce, right? When James Joyce left Ireland, he was leaving his people, his religion, and his family. And it was, a situation where, he just felt like, oh, it's easy for me to break that. And he became a different beast as a result of that. And everything kind of springing from him, both in his own immediate family and then also in his thinking, kind of, ballooned from that, right? He manifested that disassociation very well, and I think others do too. And it continues to the point where, like we had said, where when you make that decision, you don't just make it for yourself. Whether your posterity wanted to do that or not, you've made that decision for them because they can't find that which you've severed for them. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's deeply troubling, and I agree with you that it's the lack of pressure that is allowing all these balloons to float away untethered. The lack of a shared crisis. I think of the Chilean situation. I think that the consistent earthquakes. I'm here in Kharkov, right, and I look at the buildings here. And they horrify me because instinctively I look at the buildings and they have these very slender supports. And I'm like, the fucking building is going to collapse. And of course it's not going to collapse because there are no earthquakes in Ukraine, right?
Right.
And so they can make the buildings as tall as they want with as slender supports as they want, and they're going to be fine. They have this rebar. I see from my office, right next to my office, from my window, as a matter of fact, I can see another office building that they're erecting, and they're using this rinky-dink, half-inch rebar, and I'm like, what the hell? I mean, it's just half inch. It's got to go a full inch, or if it ain't a full inch, it ain't rebar. But that, of course, is the Chilean mentality. Okay, and because of that reinforcement of the buildings in Chile. The buildings, when the earthquakes hit, and they do hit, when the big ones hit, the buildings are fine. I used to live in an apartment in Chile. I was on the 15th floor when the 2010 earthquake hit, and that building had survived the 1985 earthquake, which was a 7.7 followed by a 7.5, and when the 8.5 hit in 2010, it survived it fine. I was there, and I didn't die, right? The building was spotless. I mean, it had minor damage, but nothing consequential. But the point was, see, they built it to last because they knew that there would be crises. And that very fact of the periodic crises made not just the building stronger, but the people more cohesive. Because there was a sense that, okay, we've had an earthquake, so we all have to band together. Okay, you're a fucking commie and you're a fucking fascist, fine. Just both of you pick up that thing and let's go, because we just had an earthquake. You see the sense of it.
Yeah. We're talking about the anti-fragile idea
Exactly.
from Taleb.
Exactly.
And it's funny how going back to Poland, how this manifests itself, not necessarily in how buildings are constructed. If you look at Polish literature, the most important pieces of Polish literature, the poetry coming from the 3 or 4 bards, depending on your point of view, the nationalistic poems, and the nationalistic novels, be they Pan Tadeusz, Forefathers Eve, very historically drenched, historically interested, nationally focused epics. You know when those were created? When the nation didn't exist.
Yeah.
They were written by men who were old enough to, when they were kids, remember when the nation existed. But when the nation is gone and it's only the population speaking the language, having the memory, having all their literature, that these things were created, and they perpetuated the population at a point in time when politically every effort was made to destroy that population. And not just like, oh, you don't have any borders here. It's like, no, your language will be taken from you officially if we can manage it. We will force you into this type of ethnic identity versus that type of ethnic identity. What persisted was all, under that duress, you persist and you create that cohesiveness. And that's partly my suspicion why, amongst other nations, the Poles are very strong on saying, yeah, we're not going to let Muslim populations or any minority populations or any kind of fifth column population easily enter the nation.
Yeah, because they have that sense that they can be wiped out. And the democracies of the West, they've gotten all comfortable. They've gotten so comfortable that they don't realize what they have going for them, because they think it's just the natural way of things. They don't realize how unnatural their privileged situation really is, and so they don't value it. And I think that's the problem, since we don't have any connection with older people who had less, whose situation was more precarious, or even if it was not that precarious, they must have had at some point in their lives some kind of notion that things could get really shitty, right? Because everybody goes through a shitty time in their life. I don't care what your name is. You can be Bill Gates, and I'm sure he had crappy times in his life. I bet he had money worries even after he was a billionaire, because that happens, right?
Yeah.
If you don't have any connection with those crappy times, if only by way of a story from a grandparent, then you don't value what you've got. And I think that's what's happened to our society. And so I think that what will happen is that by the time people realize how valuable what they got really is, it'll be too late. It will have been taken away from them.
That's partly why I think there's a big push now among the younger generations, the generation probably even younger than mine, to nationalism or alt-right or ethno-nationalism, what have you. Partly it's ideological, but I think that I wouldn't be surprised if in many instances they're scratching a phantom limb. Like I said, when you have their parents or even their grandparents' generation who made the decision to disassociate, and then you're this kind of left wandering, unsure of yourself, unsure of where the lessons to be brought, no real authority figure, not in the sense that no one has that power over you, it's just you don't trust it, or there's nothing really backing that authority. You try to artificially recreate that which was severed from you. In other words, you and I still have the family connection. We remember it. We were told that the family members still talk about it. I can only imagine how people who don't have that, but who want it, have to figure out how to get it. Because they will try and get it. And I don't begrudge them for trying to get it. They should get it somehow. I don't know that I have the perfect way of finding a replacement for it, but I understand the desire should be satiated somehow. I
think that the alt-right and the hard-right nationalism, and even on the flip side, the socialists and these crazy social democrats, quote unquote, and basically communists and Antifa and all those people, they're all striving towards the same thing. They're all striving towards being connected. More on the right, okay? I mean, like, now that I think about it, like, a little more coherently, because on the left, it's more that they want to have an ideology, whereas on the right, they want to have some connection, a human connection. And so they sort of like fantasize about, let's call it what it is, basically fascist ideas and concepts, you know, the 1488 and all that crap. But it's sometimes it's ironic, sometimes it's serious, but it's not really about being a Nazi. It's about having a connection, a feeling like part of a band, you know? And that our society is deliberately stripping away that very natural and very healthy impulse from young people. And so it's perverting it. And they are being driven towards extremes. Yes. And I think it's the mainstream's fault, because the mainstream does not understand that its ideology of individualism is fundamentally unhealthy. It's useful, it's economically useful, but it's socially and individually and as a people, it's unhealthy to be living for yourself like that. It's catastrophic, you know, and it leads to disaster, it seems to me, you know? But
in a very fundamental way. I mean, remember when one of the arguments, I don't know who articulated it this way, but when I heard it, I thought, yeah, that's very well. That was articulated very well. It may even be the fellow who I told you about, who was talking about why liberalism fails, or how liberalism fails. I think it's on your reading list now.
Yeah, Deneen, yeah.
Deneen. I think he phrased it thusly, which was, look, the argument against the family and tradition took the form of, they have rules and structure, but those rules are arbitrary. They are capricious. Why should I subject myself to that? I should have my own individuality and have that defined, and at least I won't be subjected to others' past decisions. Well, the reality of the situation is you don't remove the capriciousness, you just you create a new capriciousness.
Yeah.
And the thing is, at least with tradition, is when it's battle tested, right?
Yeah.
Multiple generations have gone through it. Those traditions which survive are the survivor traditions.
Yeah.
They helped you
It's
figure
Darwinian
it out. When you're doing
traditionalism.
Social Darwinianism, hey, there's some truth to it. When you're an individual and you have to basically make those traditional decisions again and doing it your own way, and oh, by the way, doing it in a way that you've severed from the experiences of the past that you have to kind of learn from, so now you have to learn it artificially, you're going to make some bad decisions more often, because it's like luck of the draw, man. I mean, you know, it's typical bell curve, or even worse, right? I mean, so you're really subjecting yourself to a lot more whim and a lot more arbitrariness than you probably were really getting with the families.
Yeah, yeah. That goes back to my central metaphor. It's you become a balloon that is at the mercy of any passing breeze, and you have no direction, and that's the tragedy. Yeah. Okay, so on that note, we're going to call it a podcast. I'm Coach Red Pill, signing off for the Coach and Benway podcast. And as always, we're going to leave the last word for the good doctor. Good doctor, what do you have to prescribe for us today?
It's actually is very much a prescription. And I'm going to say this to particularly those members of the audience who haven't had a connection. It could be with your parents, it could be with your grandparents, you know, something that you never really had a chance to talk to them about anything. Just ask them about what happened in their life when they were younger, maybe even when they were your age. Even if you don't have any topic to talk about, just ask them about it. Trust me, you are going to learn something, and more importantly, they're going to light up. Outside of odd circumstances like my grandparents, they will probably light up because you have the interest in it.
Yeah.
And they will be willing to talk about it, and you are going to get that lived experience that Coach and I got in our own ways, and really kind of added flavor and color to everything we kind of talk about. Like everything I certainly talk about is, in some sense, has a little tinge of those actual lived memories to them.
Yeah.
So really appreciate that
And just make that
memory, if you can
effort.
get it.
Just make that effort.
Yeah.
Just ask them. Just ask them, what was your life like when you were my age? What was going on? And that simple question, because no matter how unhappy your relationship with your parents or grandparents might happen to be, and no matter how fragile and or volatile that relationship, just that simple question and being truly honest and willing to just shut up and listen to them drone on and on. They might drone on and on, but you might be surprised at the few diamonds that you get among all that rock. You know what I mean? Yeah. So I fully back the good doctor's suggestion. So on that note, this is the end of the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us, and I do hope that you will listen to us on the next episode. Take it easy.
Later.